Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we're going to be talking about Guardian Defenders and discussing whether they're actually a good unit or not. So Guardian Defenders are a unit that was very popular in the beginning of the edition. A lot of players are really excited to try out Guardian Defenders once again in their games after, several editions of them being pretty much trash. In 9th edition, they were only used for screening purposes, to take them in a big squad of 20 and screen out the whole battlefield with them because obviously that was a useful tactic to use with the Webway Strike stratagem. But that's really all they were used for. They weren't that good when it came to damage, and they certainly weren't that good when it came to actually surviving attacks in 9th edition. Because obviously in 9th edition, there was a lot more AP in the game, and Guardian Defenders just didn't cut it. So when 10th edition saw their abilities reworked, everybody was really excited because Guardians are a really cool unit. They have a really cool model and an awesome kit that's easy to get for a lot of players. So players were finally happy to bring them back into the battle. And very much so, in the beginning of the edition, Guardian Defenders were actually a pretty good unit. They farmed Fate Dice. You could use as many Fate Dice as you wanted within any phase. So there was really no downside to bringing them, and they did do a pretty decent job at holding objectives down. However, as the edition went on, and the Eldar have gone through numerous changes, it was apparent that Guardian Defenders still weren't quite good enough to make the cut in competitive play, and for a long time, we didn't really see anything except for Wraith Knights and other Devastating Wound weapon units. But even after Devastating Wounds got nerfed, and we saw the resurgence of different units in the Eldar Index, there was one that was kind of just missing, and that was Guardian Defenders. Guardian Defenders have not really shown up in any competitive lists that have been successful, unlike their Storm Guardian cousins. So what we're going to do in this video is we're going to take a look at Guardian Defenders and see whether or not they're really worth fielding. So first, let's go ahead and do a quick overview of what we're going to specifically be looking at with Guardian Defenders. We're going to be looking at their stats, weapons, and special rules, their strengths and weaknesses, their combos and synergies, a full breakdown of their ability and what you can expect it to do, and lastly, the role Guardian Defenders play in an Eldar army and how to make the most out of them. So starting off with their stats, they're pretty basic stats with movement 7, toughness 3, and a 4+ save. This is typical of Eldar infantry. They also have OC 2. So they are a battle line unit, and that is something that is pretty important. It means they're better at holding objectives, and enemies can't steal objectives away from them as easily. As for their ranged weapons, they basically can take any Eldar heavy weapon with their platform. So a Bright Lance for anti-large, and an Aeldari missile launcher for a little bit of versatility and a little bit of extra range. So if you want some light anti-large, you have the Star Shot. If you want some anti-infantry or anti-light infantry, you have the Sunburst option. As for the other weapons, you have the Scatter Laser, which is effective against light infantry, and you have the Shuriken Cannon and Star Cannon, which are effective against mech targets. They are armed with Shuriken Catapults, which are effective against light infantry first and foremost, but can also chip wounds off of mech targets as well. However, the range of the Shuriken Catapults is only 18, so that is something you do have to keep in mind, that you might not be in range of every target if you're just using them as a backfield objective camper. As far as their melee weapons go, they are just armed with the basic close combat weapon that hits with strength 3 and no AP, and they only have 1 attack apiece. So you definitely don't want these guys in combat. They are very ineffective. As far as their abilities go, this is one of their main selling points, is they have this ability that when they are on an objective controlling it, they get to add a dice to your Fate Dice pool. So basically what happens is at the end of your command phase, for each objective marker you control that has one or more units from your army with this ability within range of it, roll a d6 and add it to your Fate Dice pool, displaying the result you just rolled. So you're typically not going to be able to get maybe more than 2 of these. Again, most people would only really want to run 1 of these units, but if you are running a couple of Guardian units, you can get the benefit from each one. And they really only have one option as well. So unlike Storm Guardians, who have, basically a bunch of options as far as what weapons they can take 2 fusion guns, 2 flamers, 2 power swords. The Guardian Defenders can only take 1 heavy weapon. And I think this is one of the reservations that players have about Guardian Defenders, is they're really just not that versatile with what they can do, right? You do have the heavy weapon, but typically you're going to want to take a Bright Lance on it, and the other heavy weapon options aren't really worth it in general. So, Shuriken Cannon, the range is not really that great on a unit that's going to sit on a backfield objective. The scatter laser doesn't have a lot of impact on the game in general. And we also just have a ton of anti-infantry in our lists anyway that is much better. We have a Bright Lance, which is the premier choice. It's the premier anti-large choice, but we have, again, tons of other options for that. And the Aeldari Missile Launcher, again, is one of those weapons that is versatile, but weaker at both of its roles. And while definitely still a decent weapon option on these guys, it's by no means a definitive one. So most of the time, people are just going to go with a Bright Lance, and the thought process behind this is, well, if I'm going to spend 110 points on a unit that it's going to sit in the backfield and just shoot a Bright Lance, I might as well be shooting 2 Bright Lances with something like a Warwalker and getting a bunch of other bonuses as well. So Guardian Defenders are 110 points for 10, which makes them the cheapest per model unit in the index. And they're pretty cost effective and have versatile damage for that cost. So yes, they don't have the 2 Bright Lances that the Warwalker does, which is probably the easiest comparison to make because you will give this unit a Bright Lance most of the time. But they basically swap the extra Bright Lance for Shuriken Catapults, so some extra anti-infantry fire and the ability to generate fate dice on a backfield objective. So they do a little bit of a different thing than Warwalkers and probably shouldn't be compared to them point for point. Now, obviously, if your list is lacking a lot of anti-tank and you want that extra Bright Lance, definitely go with the Warwalker squad. But Guardian Defenders do have their uses as well, especially since they are, again, the cheapest unit per model in the index. As far as their keywords go, they do have the Infantry and Grenades keyword, which does allow them to deal some extra mortal wounds, which is nice, right? Being able to roll 6d6 and deal some mortal wounds to an enemy unit is a pretty good thing and can come in clutch in a lot of different situations. Okay, so what are their strengths and their weaknesses? So they are a solid backfield objective holder and a screening unit because there's 10 of them, because you can spread them out, and because they generate fate dice on objectives. They're pretty good at just sitting in the back and screening for you. They also have decent damage that trades well against other battle line units. So a lot of people have told me that Guardians aren't good because they don't trade well with other battle line units, but if you actually do the math against just basic intercessors and don't account for things like buffs and synergies and so forth, they actually do very well and they trade very evenly. And really, just try this on a piece of paper or a calculator sometime if you're a little bit skeptical of that. 10 Guardians with a Bright Lance versus 5 intercessors, and they actually trade fairly equally. Which, again, makes sense because, when GW was balancing things, they didn't do a great job balancing everything. But one of the things I did think they got right was balancing the battle line units against each other from every single index. So that if you match them up in a straight up fight, most of the time they're going to be fairly equal in power. And the only thing that really changes this is the army's specific ability to synergize with their own battle line units. So some armies just synergize better with their battle line than others. Space Marines don't synergize super well with intercessors, whereas, an army like Imperial Guard synergizes very well with their Guard infantry. And I do feel like with the Eldar, those synergies do exist, but oftentimes there are better targets for them, right? Like, why would I cast Guide on a unit of Guardian Defenders when I can cast it on a unit of Dire Avengers? Or why would I cast Fortune on a unit of Storm Guardians when I can cast it on Wraith Guard or the Avatar? Right? And something I've done in my games as of recently is I've actually tried to circumvent those conventions that people are expecting out of my army and using Fortune on different units to see if I can hit those specific breakpoints to confuse and throw off my opponents. So for example, if you throw Fortune on Storm Guardians instead of that unit of Wraith Guard that you have first turn, the amount of resources that your opponent has available to deal with those Storm Guardians might actually not be enough. And oftentimes this will mean you gain an advantage in the objective game. Now, the last of their strengths is they are the cheapest points per model unit in the index, which means they're still pretty expendable. Yes, they are 110 points, but for the most part, they're going to be cheap enough to make a lot of opponents' indirect fire pretty inefficient. Indirect fire weapons have gotten a lot more expensive, and therefore things like basilisks and manticores and Desolator Marines are just going to be, quite frankly, pretty inefficient into them. Yes, they will kill them, but they're not going to kill enough of them typically to make it matter. And they're really going to have to expend a lot more than they want to on killing those Guardian Defenders. And something that's funny to me, and this is also why I don't put a Farseer in a unit of Guardian Defenders, is because if my opponent does have a lot of indirect fire, and I separate the Farseer and the Guardians, they're going to have to choose which one they want to kill that turn, And then if I give the Farseer the Phoenix Gem on top of that, they're really not killing anything turn 1. And that leaves the rest of my army free to do what they want. So giving your opponent hard choices like that, like do I deny them the back objective so that they can't score victory points there, or do I go after their units that can score on secondaries? And Guardians are actually very good at forcing this dilemma upon opponents. Their weaknesses, however, are they do lack options outside of the platform. So they don't get any special weapons, they don't get anything in combat, they don't get a sergeant or anything like that. So they're pretty basic, and that turns a lot of players off from using them. They're also not very adaptable, unlike Storm Guardians. So Storm Guardians have tools against infantry, but they also have tools against large targets as well. Strength 8 fusion guns aren't great against large targets, but they do trade up, and especially with a reroll to wound, you can typically get about 1 fusion gun through against a tough target, which means you can do some significant damage, and your other elements, your other anti-tank elements like Bright Lances, will have an easier time dealing with those vehicles. So unfortunately, Guardian Defenders just kind of fall by the wayside because, they don't have the options that other units do in our index. Lastly, and probably the biggest downside to Guardian Defenders, is that their role is easily filled by other units who can also perform other roles as well. One of the biggest examples of this is the Autarch Wayleaper, because you're most likely already going to have one in your list, and the Autarch Wayleaper is a lone operative, so it can't be shot at all, or 5 Rangers with Illic Nightspear, both of which cost about the same amount of points as a unit of 10 Guardian Defenders and arguably still do the other roles too, right? Like screening and providing backfield support. But what about their combos and synergy? Surely Guardian Defenders have these with some other units in the index, right? And they actually do. They do work great alongside a Farseer who can convert their Fate Dice into a 6. So they'll generate a Fate Dice. It could be, a 1, it could be a 2. A Farseer will change that into a 6 regardless, especially if they take the Bright Lance. Shroud Runners can give them lethal hits, allowing them to be, a little bit harder hitting. Guide and Doom are great offensive buffs as well, but probably are better on other units. Although, in a pinch at the end of the game, if your Guardians are still alive and all of your other damage dealers are destroyed, casting Guide on these guys isn't a bad option because they do have a large volume of attacks. And Fortune makes them a little bit more durable, but again, is usually better on other units. So you could use Fortune. If you have a Farseer in the back that's just chilling there in the late game, these guys can become quite a bit more durable with it. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at their ability, do a full breakdown on it, and what you can expect it to do. Because I think people have a misconception about what this ability actually does and how useful it is. Now, the first thing people notice about this unit usually is the ability. Their Fate Dice generation is probably the biggest draw to the unit in terms of how useful it is. However, in practice, it's not super useful, which is why a lot of competitive players don't really see Guardian Defenders as a good option. And to give you a little bit of an example of this, assuming your unit controls your home objective for all 5 turns, that's a maximum of 5 extra Fate Dice added to your pool. Typically, though, the results of 1 to 3 are pretty useless. So if you roll a 1, a 2, or a 3, that's not really that useful. Even if you have a Farseer, right? You can change that result into a 6, but then again, you already have 12 to start out, and a lot of those are going to be 1s to 3 anyway, which you can change into a 6. So they won't have much use altogether. So out of 5 turns, 2 to 3 of those turns will end up generating nothing helpful. This was way more useful when you could use more than 1 Fate Dice per phase, but now it's kind of redundant, as you do start off with 12 again, and you can only use 1 per phase. So that's why they're not really used that often, because you may get 1 or 2 good results out of them per game. You may get 1 or 2 6s, which, having a raw 6 is really useful. Having a raw 5 is really useful. Shoot, even having a 4 is pretty good. But having an extra 1, 2, or 3 added to your Fate Dice pool just really isn't that useful, and that's why a lot of players kind of stay away from this unit. Because yeah, you could be rolling hot, you could be rolling those 4s, 5s, and 6s all game, but you could also be rolling those 1s, 2s, or 3s and, not really using the ability much at all. Okay, so what is the role of Guardian Defenders in an Eldar army, and how do you make the most out of them? So even though on paper they do look like an objective camper, if you use them like that alone, they're really not going to get much value for their points. Ideally, you want them to screen your backline in the early rounds of the game and move forward to engage once the backlines are secure. So once your opponent commits their reserves, they're not going to have anything coming behind you and things like that. Your Guardian Defenders are going to want to move up to help fight for those center objectives. And that's also why I typically don't attach my Farseer to it, because if I really need to, I can always use the Farseer to hold down the home objective, and I can move the Guardian Defenders forward to fight in the middle of the board. And especially in the late game, Guardian Defenders are much more durable than they would originally let on, right? Most of the time, you're going to be in cover, which gives them a 3+ save. So that is pretty durable. They're saving on the same amount as a Marine against weapons with no AP. And even if you're going against something with AP -1, having a 4+ save against infantry weapons isn't bad. There's also another trick you can do to bait your opponent into making bad choices when it comes to targeting the Guardian Defenders. And this is what I like to call the Bright Lance platform trick. So essentially what you do is you reveal your Bright Lance platform and you kind of move it into a position outside of a ruin to where it has lines of fire, but the rest of your unit does not. So the rest of your unit is behind line of sight blocking terrain or behind a ruin, and your Bright Lance is, either in the ruin or outside of the ruin so it can draw line of sight to the enemy army. Now, of course, this also means your opponent can see you, but this is where the bait comes in, right? Your opponent is going to see that and might actually commit more than they have to be able to kill that unit. So they might take that as an opportunity to try to kill the Guardian Defenders, or at least try to kill the Guardian Defenders' heavy weapon platform. So first of all, you do get the opportunity to overwatch with the platform, and if you have a Farseer nearby, you can easily change that to a 6 and get a little bit of extra cheeky damage on a large target, like a vehicle or a monster. However, it's not going to kill that vehicle or monster, it's just going to make them a little bit easier to kill later in the game. Next, your opponent's going to try to fire at the Guardian Defenders. So remember, though, that they have to fire one unit at a time. So unless they're just firing off a huge Death Star, most likely, with the benefit of cover and all that, you're only going to force maybe 2, maybe 3 wounds on the Guardian Defender unit. Now, the Guardian Defender platform has 2 wounds. So what I like to do is I like to force my opponent to move into positions to shoot the Guardian Defenders, shoot them with the first unit, then instead of taking out Guardians from the back, I just take out the platform and the unit is out of line of sight once more. My opponent has just moved a significant amount of his army to try to kill the Guardian Defenders and has only succeeded in killing the Bright Lance platform. My opponent's units are now out of position and I can use the rest of my army to sweep them off the table. And my opponent hasn't really gained anything significant, right? I still control that back objective. My opponent can't sweep my unit off of it. Yes, he's killed a Bright Lance, but I probably have more anti-tank in my army anyway, and I did get some damage out of it with a cheeky overwatch. And then, of course, later in the game, when my Guardians want to engage other units and try to, kind of wrestle for those mid objectives, they're still going to have the OC to be able to, get on those objectives and possibly steal them away from my opponents. And to be real with you guys, the Bright Lance platform is going to have diminishing returns throughout the battle. Not only are the opponent's large elements going to be destroyed by the end of the battle, pretty much, but, the platform has OC too, so it's not able to wrestle for objectives in the same way that Guardian Defenders are. Alright, so in conclusion, Guardian Defenders are a fairly decent backfield screening unit that also has some decent anti-infantry and overwatch punch with the Bright Lance. And you do have the option of baiting your opponent into trying to shoot at the Guardian squad if you do reveal only the Bright Lance. And that's something you can't really do with the Warwalker, right? With the Warwalker, you have to fully commit, right? I mean, you can't use Phantasm on a Warwalker anymore, and Fire and Fade is just too much of a command point cost typically to be warranting using on a Warwalker. However, with the Guardian Defender squad, you only have to sacrifice that Bright Lance, and again, unless your opponent is running a huge Death Star, which has, multiple types of anti-infantry attacks, most likely they're just not going to be able to kill the unit with a single unit of their own. And let me tell you, even if they end up killing 5 Guardians and the platform, it's still fine because you still have control of that objective, and most likely you'll still be able to screen out enemy reserve elements with 5 Guardians. If you, spread them out and place them accordingly. So it's not really a big deal. Your opponent basically loses that model that they use to shoot at you because you're going to shoot them right back. and they don't really gain much from it. So having said that, to make the most out of Guardian Defenders, you really do need to use them for more than just babysitting, and look for opportunities for them to put pressure on enemy units moving into the midfield, and also bait your opponents into making mistakes, right? And to a lot of opponents, that's going to be a target that's a little bit too juicy to pass up, especially if they have a unit that's in the vicinity that can shoot them, right? So I've had this happen many times, even against good players that have seen the Bright Lance in the open. They say, I know you're up to some trickery. You're going to phantasm it out of the way or something like that. But no, I don't. I just let them shoot it. I let them kill it. And then, of course, I'm out of line of sight once more. So yeah, for those clever autarchs among you, there are ways of getting much more mileage out of your Guardian Defenders than initially meets the eye. And definitely let me know about your experiences with Guardian Defenders in the comment section. I really like Guardian Defenders. I don't think they're as good as Storm Guardians typically, but I still think they can be a solid unit if used cleverly. All right, everybody, that is going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching. And thank you so much to all my patrons and supporters who have supported the channel over the last year. Your help has greatly improved the channel and helped it grow significantly. If you do want a way to support the channel, I have free trials activated for my Patreon, which will grant you permanent access to our Discord community, which is a community of Eldar players and enthusiasts who like talking about strategy, tactics, and of course, hobbying. I will leave the link for that in the description. And also, just to let you guys know, those of you who are thinking about joining the channel's Discord, but maybe are a little bit on the fence, I am pretty active. So if you ever wanted any advice or anything like that, or wanted to talk about some tactics sometime, I am more than happy to do that. I am also an Amazon affiliate and have a channel store page. So if you want to grab some Eldar inspired apparel on my channel store page for the holidays, or you just wanted to grab some discounted Eldar miniatures on Amazon, I will leave the links for those in the description as well. All right, everybody, that is going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching and have a great Christmas and a great holiday season. Have a good one, everybody. Peace out.